This is a Reforge event. My name is Matt Greenberg. I'm actually the CTO here at Reforge, but I run product engineering, design, and data, and a couple other things along the way. I'm joined by my friend Casey Winters, who, for those of you who are kind of coming in live, has a fire alarm going off in his building, which is part of the fun of work from home and dealing with some of those dynamic things. Today, we're going to talk a lot about product strategy, and we'll have the opportunity to sort of get a chance to learn from Casey, who just recently left his role as the Chief Product Officer at Eventbrite. He's also been at a variety of other companies through some interesting product strategy stories, including advising a ton of companies that we all use on a regular basis. The focus of most of the day, though, is going to be Q&A. For those who haven't used the Zoom webinar product before, you can feel free to just drop questions in, and they'll be able to be upvoted into the system. And I'm really happy to get any support with some great questions from y'all that you upvote. Brittany, Harsha has his first question here. Are we using any Slack channels in the Reforge member Slack for this?
We are not. You can just drop your questions here in the Q&A.
Yeah, Harsha is one of our Reforge members, shows up to a lot of our different programs, might be the record holder for most programs taken. For those who aren't familiar with Reforge, we help product managers do the best work of their career, as well as like other people in tech business, marketing, engineering, design, just helping you learn how to think about product strategy and how to ship really amazing stuff. So Casey and I were going to start off talking a little bit about altering product strategy as we deal with kind of turbulent times. So for those who have less kind of awareness of the world right now, the general market has been kind of moving in a worse direction. Stocks are plummeting, not a lot of money is going out of venture. And a lot of companies are using this as a moment to think about how they might change their product strategy or start to think of changing their product strategy. This is true even at Reforge, where we're starting to think about the different ways that we might tackle like what's to come versus what we're doing right now. It looks like Casey might be trying to join us again, possibly from his phone as he exits the building for fire alarm. So in our world, when I think about when we should make changes, there's a few things that really heavily impact product strategy. And I usually start by thinking of what I would call the product strategy stack. And the first stack of any good product strategy is the company strategy. The company strategy kind of dictates where's the company going, what's our long-term vision, what's our mission, and how are we trying to think about what we want to eventually get to and do as an organization. And your product strategy ladders up to your company strategy. At a lot of tech companies, the nuance and difference between company strategy and product strategy can be quite narrow. Product strategy often elicits like most of the changes that you're going to have to deal with as a company. So in the case of company strategy, it changes in turbulent times in a pretty unique way, which is that a lot of times you're thinking about a few different things as you move as a business. One is if you're a privately held company or even a publicly held company, you're thinking about kind of the value your business is creating over a longitudinal period. So in the case of what might be like a normal cadence for a company, they might try and look to fundraise every 18 months. And the burn rate, which is your the difference between your revenue and your costs, is often going to set your company up so that you spend your money at the rate that you're expecting to then fundraise again. So if you're not either making more revenue or controlling your costs and your burn rate starts to change, it can really impact when you need to fundraise by, which changes the way that you're thinking about your company. Or in a public company, it might be like what your valuation is at any given moment. When the markets start to change, what you see is that either the milestones for your valuation or the timing in which you fundraise might change with it. And once those constraints start to change, the company strategy can change a lot, because you might say, we need to burn less money so that we can last longer until this issue is up. Or we might be able to make investments that didn't make sense before because we're talking about a longer horizon window. A common example of this at different companies I've worked at has been SEO strategy. SEO can take a long time to start to accrue benefits, like 12 to 18 months to start to see it being meaningful as a growth lever. So when you're moving in that direction, you might see the fact that SEO might not make sense because it's not giving you enough return in the window between your fundraisers that you can kind of pay dividends to that investment in the right time window. But if instead of fundraising every 18 months, in a downturn, you might look to fundraise in 24 or 36 months instead, you could make a deeper investment in something like SEO, and it's okay for it to take a while to start to turn around to some sort of like meaningful outcome for you. So once you have that kind of understanding of how your company strategy might be influenced by the dynamics of the market, you can see if then your product strategy starts to get influenced by the dynamics of the market. So you're looking at changes in fundraise cadence, changes in burn rate that you need to manage to, different constraints that might exist, different buyers who maybe won't have money in the market. The thing that we're looking at Reforge is with next year, we're expecting like education budgets to get slimmed at some of these companies because they're spending less. Or like a lot of SaaS companies are seeing people try and like renegotiate or cancel their contracts in order to save money. And it's only those things that are really necessary that people are keeping around. The flip side of that is oftentimes programs like MBAs run counter-cyclical because people get laid off and they don't think they're going to find work again. So they might invest in something like an MBA, which is a full-time program for some period of time. So when you see like how those market dynamics change, you can see the influence in your company strategy, which can see the influence in your product strategy. So you might change the user that you're targeting. Some of the things that you're working on could become more or less important than they were previously. So in Harsha's question here, if my company has a product and service strategy, what should I do to handle both of these in combo as affected by turbulent times? And the answer is that each of those strategies might be impacted very differently by what's happening. So if you look at the world as you see, you might run into these situations where maybe those services are coming up more or less because companies are moving either from FTEs to contractors, which means rather than they might lay off some full-time employees and replace them temporarily with like services contracts, which could help you, versus it could be a situation where everyone's cutting those services contracts because they're not working on it in the most immediate terms. In the case of what we're looking to do with product, that can have a very different thing because oftentimes services have a kind of shorter horizon line between when you can tell if your investments are working or not working. They have like a sales cycle for them. So what's happening in the immediate market might be different. Whereas product, you can just change the horizon line that you're operating on. So rather than doing smaller things that have nearer term impact, if your product isn't as well fit right now, you could be focusing on things that have longer term impact to kind of catch the rebound in market. Harsha asked another question here. If turbulent times upsets the PMF apple cart, what should we do to update, pivot, and reset the product strategy? I'd say if you look at the different downturns we've had over the last 20 years, a lot of companies come out of those downturns as like the new next batch of massively successful companies in tech. And the way that you can think about that, a good example is actually Credit Karma, which is a company I worked at for 5 years. Credit Karma was founded in 2007. It's a US-based fintech. And if you look at 2008 financial crisis was probably not good for recently funded US-based fintechs. And Credit Karma had a few very, very thin years following that, where it was incredibly hard for them to kind of find traction and monetization in what they're doing. And when they approached that, they looked ahead and said, how do we think people will rebound from this? What are they looking for? And they kind of followed that rebound to find new product market fit for how the industry was changing, coming at the other side of what they were working on. And I think that's part of what a lot of companies need to do. The flip side of that is sometimes products aren't going to work in a given market. And if you're on a product market fit journey, you might need to decide this is just not a thing that we can do right now. This is not going to be a successful opportunity for us. And we won't get a chance to sort of win. And you can either pivot really substantially, or even you'll see like a lot of companies just get shuttered in those sorts of scenarios, or product lines at major organizations that don't necessarily make sense. The next question I hear is, are pricing pivots a good approach to product strategy, retention, or should price be kept the same to preserve product value? Monetizations is a very complicated topic, and pricing is often harder to raise than easier to lower. In this case, I think you always have to be really thoughtful about pricing strategies that you do. There are temporary discounting strategies you might do in a given period. You could think about how that might be attached to some form of PR loop, like assisting people who are have been laid off or making changes to their jobs, and how you might help them in that scenario as a way to sort of like increase users. Those things should align strongly with your product strategy. So in that case, you might say, revenue is not our target metric this year, new member acquisition is. And we think that we'll be able to create a situation where we can have more meaningful new member acquisition in this period, and then we'll learn how to like monetize those users later. And I think you only want to make pricing strategy changes that are like more permanent if you think that those make sense for the long term. Casey, it looks like you might be back with us.
I am. Sorry for the issue. I'm currently sitting in a park, but I've been listening to your responses, and they're great.
Awesome. Well, Casey, talk to me about a time in your career where you faced some turbulent times at a company you were at, and how it might have impacted your product strategy. Yeah,
absolutely. So, two different things happened at the same time with the company I was working at and with a company I was advising, which is, I joined Eventbrite in June of 2019, and the pandemic started to be noticeable in our metrics February 2020. And then by April 2020, we had what's called negative revenue, which I didn't know was possible. But negative revenue is when you're processing more refunds than transactions on a daily basis.
Whew.
So a lot of the pain people are feeling now due to various economic pressures, we felt right at the beginning of the pandemic. So in April of 2020, we had to lay off 45% of the company, pause all marketing spend, and rewrite the strategy of the business so that we could raise money so that we wouldn't go out of business. We did all of those things in April 2020. And at the same time, I was working with a company called Ritual, which was a Greylock investment that I became an advisor of. And their entire product was around ordering ahead at local restaurants and coffee shops, mainly for downtown cores. So you could think of it as like the Starbucks loyalty app for every other independent, coffee shop and restaurant that you would order, lunch at. And of course, everyone stopped going to work. So they were experiencing the exact same problem. And I think, one being like a Series C startup and one being a public company, there's different ways that you perceive that change, right? If Eventbrite was a Series C startup, we would have probably pivoted to online events because that was the only type of event that was legal, right? We didn't know how long the pandemic would be, but we also knew that as a public company that needs to be driving considerable revenue and growth and profitability, that we didn't think online events was long-term a large enough category to do that. So our approach was, we're going to dramatically change our product strategy for the long term to convince investors to give us money, but we're going to focus that on the long-term opportunity, not the short-term opportunity, which is, we're going to do some online event stuff to make money now, but we're really, working on rewriting the company strategy to be around how do we help creators drive growth to their events instead of just help them get paid for their events. Ritual, being a Series C startup, not as much not as much money in the bank, they basically had to assume that their product market fit was permanently broken and that they had to find new product market fit. So they had to think of what is a total pivot to the company. And if COVID resolves and the product market fit that they had prior to the pandemic comes back, of course they can lean back into it. But you basically, with the amount of runway they had to assume it was gone forever. So you could see that difference in mid-stage startup versus public company. Public company, we could play for the long term, assuming that we could raise enough money to get to the long term. And early stage startup can't really do that, right? You have to play for now. So as a public company, we did rewrite the strategy of the business. We canceled 80% of what we were doing. And we decided to position the company towards how do we help creators drive more ticket sales rather than just help them with efficiency, which was what we were doing before. And in the first year, because most events were illegal, it was kind of like getting a year off from being a public company. Because in a public company, every quarter you're expected to put up growth numbers, right? And investors care a lot about that. Investors knew we weren't going to put up any growth numbers. So it was a great time to clean up technical debt, to think about our long-term architecture, and to make sure we could get everyone at the company bought into the 3-year strategy. And that was really successful. Whereas, Ritual, we had to pivot the business pretty aggressively, did that successfully. The company's, still going, has now a really great, online ordering product for restaurant websites and things like that that are very different from the original product. But you can see some very different approaches there, based on the maturity of the company.
So Casey, when you're in a situation like that, it's probably easy in retrospect to say, oh, we're going to make the decision to invest in these other business lines. These are the things that make the most sense for us to do long term. Walk me into the room a little bit and tell me about what the dynamics of those conversations looked like and how you sort of settled on what you were ultimately going to do. And what was that kind of hard bits of those conversations?
Yeah, great question. So I would say the fortunate thing about the timing of the pandemic for me and for our CFO, who is one of the other new executives that was hired around the time that I joined, is it was just enough time for us to really understand what was not going right with the business prior to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So, as the CFO, Lanny had really gone through all of our unit economics of the different business lines and understood, what had growth behind it, what had profitability behind it. I had talked to all the users and understood, where product was strong, where it was weak, which segments were growing, which segments weren't growing, which features were being used, not used, which things were monetizable, all that kind of stuff. So the timeline of making the decision was very quick. Essentially, I got a message from our CEO on Friday that I had to write a new strategy for the business on Saturday so that we could review it on Sunday so that we could start pitching to private equity on Monday. And that document was very easy to write. And it was very easy to align the executive team on. I basically wrote through, here are the opportunities we have. There's 4 or 5 different strategic options. It's better if we're really bold and focused, given that we're likely going to have a smaller team to do it. And here are the pros and cons of the different options. And here's the one I'm proposing, which is, focusing on smaller frequent creators and helping them get better at marketing, and then leading into the proprietary demand, which is, a part of the business that's been growing really healthily. So we were able to align. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, so it sounds like one of the things that really helped you there is that you'd been doing the day-to-day work of having that qualitative feedback from your users and an understanding of the types of problems you could be working on, even if they weren't prioritized at the time. And the main input you looked at this point was this decision about should we be adjusting to the market or not, as you're looking at these different options that you pursue.
Right. So, top down, right, as an executive, I had spent, the first 6 months of my tenure talking to customers, looking at all the data, and understanding from the internal teams all the things we're currently working on, what was working, what was not working. And a lot of things weren't working. So those were the easiest things to say, we're no longer going to do them. In a peacetime environment, the process to unwind a big initiative, as you know, Like it's long and delicate. You have to get a bunch of people on board and make sure, that they're comfortable with it and why this is right for the business. Whereas, there's a saying in leadership, don't waste a crisis. Given this crisis, we were able to say like, nope, these are the right things for the business. We're going to do them immediately. And we're going to explain to the entire company why. And we have to do it to survive, right? So it's not that we wouldn't have made some of these strategic changes eventually without the pandemic, but the pandemic forced us to accelerate. And in the long run, that's good for us, right? Because we're on the right long-term trajectory, earlier. But that was the tops down point of view. And the bottoms up point of view was more so that we should be building a great, online events product. And we should build native video and all this kind of stuff. That's obviously where all the demand was going. It went from, less than 1% of revenue to all of our revenue relatively quickly. And, me being able to step back and say like understanding where we're going long-term and understanding the market size of this long-term and the competitive landscape of this long-term and what the core competencies of Eventbrite are, do we have a right to win when like video tech is the core of the product? Do we even have any engineers who know how video tech works today? And the answer was no, right? So we're able to pretty easily evaluate that, knowing there was another long-term direction for us to go instead of doing like a panicky pivot to where the money was today. And in retrospect, we feel really good about that decision. So there's making that decision and putting it into place. But I'd say that isn't the end of it, right? So we did raise, $100 million, and we ended up not really needing to touch it because we were able to rebound. But the explanation to the company, you can't just kind of do that once and move on, right? People will go do the grindy work they know they need to do to help the company survive, but then there's like getting them bought in long-term, right? Mm-hmm. So I found that initially just trying to pitch, here's what the future is like and why that's great, was not the best option. And instead pivoted for my team to saying, here's the entire process I went through and how I got to this decision. You might have agreed with some of these other approaches being better. Here's why I ruled them out. And then doing a lot of one-on-one conversations to really customize that to people who are more affected. And that seemed to work really well. And look, a bunch of people opted out of the company at that time, right? Because this was not the product vision they signed up to work on. And that's great, right? The important thing is that they clearly know what the product vision is and why we made that call.
And that sounds a lot like Carolina's question here about how to maintain your team's focus on the important things. Talk to me about this like narrowing. You said we're not going to have as many resources. You had some people you had to lay off. Probably like morale wasn't necessarily great, but you really wanted people who were kind of on the bus for this experience. How did you continually hammer home that focus over time?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a short and long term answer to this question. The short term is we're going to do whatever we can to help creators survive during this really tough period, because those are our customers. And the way that you operate that is very different from like a normal product strategy where you're prioritizing, you're trying to figure out like, oh, what's the impact of this? What's the chance of success, right? And it was like, my response was basically, no, like if it's anything we think has any chance of helping a creator save their business, we're going to do it. We're not going to ask how hard it is. We're not going to try to estimate the impact. And we're also not going to retroactively ask, was that the right decision? We're going to throw everything we got at saving our customers' businesses. And we're not going to look back and say we could have done more. So that was the short term. And we felt really good about that decision. Most of our event creators were able to save their business. But there were definitely people like, what do they call it? Monday morning quarterbacking it, right? Like, oh, it turns out we didn't need to build that feature. And it's like, but we didn't have that information then. Not building it would have been the wrong decision, even though it turned out that wasn't the key thing. The key thing was unknowable at the time. So we built everything we could brainstorm to help. So that's kind of like the short term, more like really focused, anything possible that we can brainstorm that will help, we'll just go ship as soon as possible. Then there's the sequence from that to, so I think in general, product managers, designers, et cetera, it's easy to get behind, like, you know, if you have any sort of customer empathy, which normally we do in our job, it's easy to get behind like, oh, just do anything we can to help them. Like that's a pretty good way of aligning the company short term. It's sequencing from that to, well, the thing that makes the most sense to help, you know, event creators with is their growth versus some, you know, finance feature they're asking for, or some ticket transfer feature they're asking for. That's when like the rubber really hits the road on alignment. So we just kept in, you know, the product weeklies, which we do every week with the entire product team, with our all hands, you know, at the entire company level. We kept hammering home, this is what the strategy is, this is why it is this way, and this is how it's going to lead to, you know, superior value to our event creators, to our consumers, you know, and to the business. And be really transparent with questions. Like I started doing, you know, AMAs very regularly with the team because this is a lot of new information to absorb. And I think I approach things with something I call transparent optimism, which is like, I'm going to tell you exactly what's going on. I'm going to tell you exactly what's broken. And then I'm going to tell you why I still think we can win. And, you know, basically, you know, treating your team as adults and that they can handle the information when it's not all positive, because, you know, our teams are not idiots. They could see what's going on in the numbers. They could see what's going on in the market. They know it's not all positive out there. When you try to hide that and focus only on the positive, it leads distrust. When you embrace kind of, hey, here are all the things that are going wrong, and here's why I still think there's a path to success, I think that tends to be the best approach, especially in troubled times like this.
Yeah, so one of the questions here from Vishvak is basically instilling and forming a new company culture after a layoff. And this like idea of transparent optimism and kind of treating your team like grown-ups makes tons of sense from the highest level. What are some of the other things that you felt like you needed to do in that moment to make sure that the team stayed and adopted that optimism while still being kind of authentic?
Yeah, look, I don't think you're going to be able to do anything that gets all of the people who aren't laid off to stay. There's going to be more people who leave after an event like that. Chances are layoffs affected their friends or permanently damaged like some trust in the company or in leadership. So I think one of the things that's important to do, and you've seen companies that have done a good job of this and companies that have done a poor job of this, is you want to make sure if you're doing a layoff, which is a real morale killer, that you're only doing it once. You think you've seen some companies that have ended up having to lay off 2 or 3 times during the last couple of years. And it's really hard to repair that. I think everyone, you know, it was really interesting when we did our layoff because everyone understood. They're like, look, I've seen the numbers. I know we're not making any money. I knew this was coming. You told me in an all hands this was likely happening in a few weeks. So it sucks that I'm affected or not affected, or that my friend is affected, not affected. But you prepared us for this, you know, as a likely outcome, right? So I think that's one part that, you know, isn't always possible, but I think was helpful for me, ensuring that this is the only time we'll need to do this, and being able to back that up. Like, don't say that, you know, and lie, and then have to do another layoff, you know, in the next 3 months. And then, like, yeah, what is something we can unify around? Well, we can unify in Eventbrite's case around the new strategy, but, you know, also to the question's point, the culture has changed. So one of the things we also did after this is we rewrote the cultural values of the company, and we did that with the company. So I led an exercise. There's this Harvard Business Review article called The Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture. It breaks down the predominant cultural styles of leaders. Like, are you a learning focused culture? Are you a results focused culture? Are you a security focused culture, et cetera? And I had our executive team go through what they were, like what style of leader they were, and what they felt the company was like. And then we did that on a bunch of attributes. Like, are we transparent or are we closed? Are we, you know, bring our whole self to work? Or are we just entirely focused on the work? You know, there's all these attributes where you can be on one end of the spectrum or another culturally. And it's not that any of them are wrong or right. You know, every culture is different, right? So we mapped out for each of us what our attributes were. We mapped out where we felt the company was, and we mapped out where we felt the company should go. That mapped to the new strategy. And then we talked with other people at the company and said, hey, here's our point of view of where we are and where we're going, but you tell us, like me and the chief people officer at the time, we built like a council of people that wanted to work on the new values, and we were just there for feedback. But the team wrote the new values, they got feedback from us, and we shipped out to the company, a few months later. And I do think that was important to say, like, hey, this is a different company with a different strategy. It doesn't have all the same people. And is all this lining up to a place that you want to work for the next 3 to 5 years? And the answer may be no, right? And it's not our job to try to retain everyone. It's our job to try to make sure the right people are here for the right reasons. So I think that was a really good exercise. And a lot of people could say like, oh, you weren't making any money. Why are you working on this fluffy cultural stuff? But I think it was really important to say like, hey, here's the company we're building out of this crisis for the long term. And we think it's going to be a great place to work and have great results for our customers and as a business. And we want you to know all of it and make a commitment.
Yeah, one of the things that you touched on earlier was this idea of pushing down a lot of decision making during these turbulent times and just saying like, hey, we're focused on helping the customer. And another thing I heard you mention was this idea of like context sharing, like, hey, I'm available for an AMA. I want to share all this information.
Yep.
Talk to me about how the landscape continues to change over time. And you don't necessarily want to regret decisions you made when information wasn't available, but how are you keeping abreast as to new information that's coming available and helping make sure your next decisions are better, especially across kind of such a broad goal as helping our content creators grow?
Yeah. So, we have a few business mechanisms, and they're probably similar ones at many of the companies you all work at. The first one we do is we do what we call a weekly revenue working group, which is where we get the signal from all of the people directly driving, growth, whether it's through sales or marketing or through product-driven growth, things like, SEO, conversion, what we're learning, what results we're creating, but more importantly, what we're learning and what new opportunities is that creating. And, in some cases, what we're learning is we're not exactly going on the right track. So one of the things that, and then we have a monthly operating review, which is like objectively, let's review all the OKRs. Why are we on or off track? What do we want to do about that? And so to take a particular example, one of the pillars of the new strategy was our event creators do a lot of their own marketing to bring people to Eventbrite to transact. They're not expert marketers like some people on this call or some people we've been in Reforge programs with. They know some things and they're successful, but they don't exactly have all the insights a company that Eventbrite scale has related to marketing. So how could we use our knowledge of the event marketing business to make them more successful? So what we did is we built some marketing tools to help event creators. We built an email marketing tool, and we built a tool that helps you optimize your Facebook ads, because as Eventbrite, we're more likely to know who's interested in the ticket, who's interested in the event that you're putting on, than you fiddling around with some Facebook controls on your own, because we sit on top of all the transaction data. We see what everyone buys. So we launched those new products, and early on it was good. And then they kind of flattened out. And, we had to decide like, hey, continuing to build new marketing tools is not the lever. The lever is getting creators to understand these marketing tools, to build awareness of them, and to ultimately get the value out of them. So we made kind of a hard shift from building out marketing functionality to messaging that functionality better, integrating it with the core product better, so more people would find it, learn how to use it. Because, we all work in technology, right? So most people on this call are familiar with app tracking transparency with iOS 14 and all the changes Facebook made to how, their advertising product works. Our event creators have heard of none of that. They just go run Facebook ads today, like they tried to run them 2 years ago, and they're like, they don't work as well. Must be more competition. And we, of course, know that's not true. And also, since we sit on top of all the transaction data, our Facebook ads work just as well today as they did 2 years ago. So how do we use that both knowledge and technical capability we have to pass that on to our creators and explain that in a way that doesn't get into, Apple policy changes, which they definitely don't want to know about. It's not core to their business, is more the pivot we had to make over the last quarter. And that's working, right? We've now reignited growth of those marketing tools. So there's certainly a lot of work to be done, throughout the next year. So we use these meetings to really talk through okay, we didn't actually hit our target this month. What created that? And let's be real about what we need to do to change that, trajectory. And it might be oh, we missed the target, but we learned the exact thing we needed to do to hit the target for the next 6 months. And sometimes it's look, we've missed the target for 2 months. We don't feel like we have the key insight on why we're not going in the right direction. So I think it's been a really important, rhythm of the company for us. And I think, as a leader, sometimes I need to push on, hey, we're not changing the strategy enough based on what we're learning. I think there could be a tendency, especially when you write out a 3-year strategy, it sounds all great on paper, to be no, we're sticking to the strategy. We're just going to keep doing what that thing says. And we're no wiser than we were 3 years ago than we wrote it. And of course, that's silly, right? But the flip side is also bad, where you are just changing strategy all the time. And, no strategies work without some grit and determination to get to the other side. You want to be in that middle zone, right? Where you're taking in new information, but still committed to the long-term vision. And if you can stay right there and have these mechanisms like revenue working group or monthly operating review to be in that balance of the middle, I think that's where you start to get the superior results.
And when you're doing all of these things, are you thinking in terms of a quantitative metric that you can sort of rally everyone around, or is it continuing to be a qualitative goal?
So we do both, right? So take the event creator side of our business, consumer side of business is a little bit different. On the event creator side of the business, we have a couple top level key results. One of which is how many active hosting creators we have, how many creators are hosting events. And then another is what we call the creator product experience score, which is a qualitative metric, survey-based metric, which is how good a fit do creators feel our product is for their business. And there's a few questions in it. And we talk about this as a case study in the product strategy program. So we have both the qual side and the quant side. So obviously we want to have as many, we have monthly hosting creators and monthly transacting creators. And those are the quantitative metrics. And then of course there's downstream things like that, which is new creators versus retention. And we look at those things too. But we also felt it important, because our product strategy is about building a great self-service experience for our event creators. They shouldn't need to talk to a human. They shouldn't need to have a dedicated account manager to be successful. We needed to find a way to measure that. So we created this creator product experience score that, objectively should be going up as we're making the product more intuitive and more useful. And fortunately it has. But that's also not going to have as quick a feedback loop as some of the quantitative metrics of how many creators you acquired this week or things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Brittany, can we get Alexandria or Vishvak to ask their question live?
Sure. I just gave Vishvak permission to speak, so go for it.
Great.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. First of all, Casey and Matt, thank you so much for putting together this session. It's very insightful and really appreciate it. Lots of love from Singapore. We're actually dialing in from Singapore right now. So actually, Casey, I had a quick question. You really touched on a couple of experiences in both small as well as large scale startups, right? So I was wondering, so silos must be an issue, especially when small or medium-sized startups are eventually scaling upwards, right? So how can we reduce this across teams, especially when communicating the product and growth visions to other teams, for example, customer success or operations or other kind of teams that aren't exactly having this as part of their OKRs, for example, right? So how do we reach a point where we share a shared company vision? That's my question.
Yeah, great question. So I think breaking down silos is really important to me. And everything we do at Eventbrite, and this was certainly true at Pinterest, is a cross-functional team between, people working together as a team that report into different functional leaders. So I strongly believe in that. And that's not just product eng design, but also, we had customer support people come into all of our, meetings, and researchers and things like that as well. So you want to try to build the default unit of who's working on a problem to be as cross-functional as possible. But again, if there's 12 people to align, it's going to move a lot slower than if there's 3 people to align. So one of the things we use to mitigate that inside of Eventbrite and other companies is the DAISY model of like, who's the driver, right? Who's the approver, right? Like who's consulted and collaborating and who's informed. And that may not be everyone on the cross-functional team so that we can continue to move speed. But if there's that concept of a cross-functional team, there's trust. If you're not in the DAISY for this particular component, that you're going to be informed eventually, and that the people that you trust the people make good decisions. When you think about this broader level of, okay, we're making this change around marketing tools in my previous example, right? We've built out, and I think this is more common in B2B than B2C, a much more sophisticated, we call GTM process, where we're bringing in, teams like sales and customer support in at the beginning of the process to make sure their feedback is heard. And then we also have a process of informing them how product development is going and rolling out to them and making sure they're trained on all the changes that are happening. When you're in kind of these different types of businesses, the approach with which in product particular, you synthesize feedback can be very different. So if you're an enterprise business, let's say, you could generally just go talk to your customers directly. There aren't that many of them. They tell you exactly what they want, and they're pretty rational actors. And you can get away with kind of just building what they want and taking their money. And then if you're a hardcore consumer business like Pinterest, then you can just run an A/B test all the time to understand what's working, what's not working. And when you get a surprising result, you can do some research around it to understand the why by talking to users. Eventbrite's in between those two extremes, where sure, we have pretty good consumer scale and we can run, A/B tests on things like conversion optimization and whatnot. But everything related to the creator side of the business is not enterprise, it's SMBs. So there are a lot of them. We probably have like a million active creators over the course of like a year. But they're also not business experts in their field like an enterprise buyer. So we have to do a lot of research to understand their problems and infer solutions. But we also have to do that same research internally. So we have to talk to sales. We have to talk to customer support. We have to talk to marketing. And the job of a product manager in a company like Eventbrite, which is kind of in the middle between like the enterprise and consumer extremes, is you have to take all this feedback and unify it and synthesize it into, okay, we're going to do X thing, and then communicate that back to all those stakeholders, right? So we have more sources of feedback into what develops our strategy and our roadmap than say an enterprise company or a pure consumer company. And that makes it a little bit more challenging. But what it also forces is sales and marketing and customer support are going to get a view into our thinking a lot earlier than a classic problem in consumer, which is like, hey, we just built this thing, product marketing, why don't you name it and launch it, whatever launch means. So that's how we try to approach it at Eventbrite. But it's all, you have to think about your product development process needs to be iterated on the same way your product needs to be iterated on. So we have a team called product ops, and it's their job to iterate on the product development process to make it more efficient over time. How we communicate to stakeholders internally, how we test, how we make sure we plan most effectively, most efficiently. That's really the scope of product ops in our org. And it's something that continues to grow and evolve. But that's the approach we take. And it's definitely not going to be perfect, but it's definitely gotten a lot better over the last 3 or so years.
Yeah, I think what Casey's saying really stands out to me, and I want to pull one piece out just to kind of pin it for everybody, which is at any given time, you can either have silos or you can have too many people involved in a decision. And what matters is continually iterating to try and find the Goldilocks zone in the middle. So you have you're going to always be somewhere usually that's a little too far in one direction, and you want to keep looking at your process and your system because your company grows and changes. The functions that exist grow and change. Your org structures grow and change. So you're going to kind of constantly be tweaking it, and being too siloed and going slowly because too many people are involved are always problems all companies have, and humans are involved. They're difficult. So you just have to keep working on it. Great. Belinda Navi, can we pull you up and hear your question? Belinda, you here?
Belinda, you should be able. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Sorry, I didn't have a question. I think I accidentally pressed
Awesome.
the button.
Why don't we see if we can get Alexandria up?
Awesome.
Great.
Great. Hey there, Alex, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
Alex from Elevest. Thanks for holding the webinar today. I was really interested in what you were talking about in terms of the culture, like after a layoff. So, I think any startup right now is trying to extend their runway, and was just wondering if you could deep dive a little bit into some of those attributes that you all were exploring. I know you gave like one or two examples, but I don't know if you have a list or something that you can share.
Let me pull up the spreadsheet. Give me 1 minute. I'll find it.
Yes. Thank you.
Got to go dig into Google Drive, which is always a journey.
A great experience on mobile too, Casey.
I'm making it work. Okay. Okay. Cultural values worksheet. Here we go. So, see, this is the wrong tab. I need second tab. Okay. So here were the axes that we chose. I'm not saying these are perfect for your company, but the first one was secretive versus transparent, for profit versus for good, speed versus quality, independent versus interdependent, stable versus flexible, whole self versus focused on the work. And for those of you, this one makes a lot less sense. There was a whole stir around this time from companies like Coinbase and Basecamp saying like, you can't talk about politics at work. You have to only talk about, the stuff you're working on directly. So this was very much like in the news at the time. That's what that means. Equity versus equality. So this is, are we paying everyone the same? Are we promoting everyone the same? Or are we like aggressive in paying for performance and promoting for performance? And the last one is top down versus bottoms up decision making. So I built a little spreadsheet with, drop downs, and everyone got to pick where they were on each of those attributes. And then we had a, debate around where Eventbrite is on those attributes and where Eventbrite should be on those attributes moving forward. Probably not a surprise, but if you read the Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture, Eventbrite is a standard caring culture. If you read that article, and what we wanted to do was keep that core, but also move to be more learning oriented and results as like secondary elements to our culture. And I think we've been able to balance those, now a couple of years later. But it's a great article. And yeah, you can probably Google it fairly easily. I don't know how to drop links on mobile into this format.
We'll look for it and send it out in a follow-up email to everybody who attended.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Alexandria. Daniel Hoyas, can we pull Daniel up?
Go for it, Daniel.
Hey, thanks again for hosting this, guys. Just very quickly, you mentioned a lot of cross-functional teams working on a project board. And I was just curious as to what you found is the best way for those teams to update the rest of the company. It's kind of going back to the silos versus too many people in the meetings. I'm just curious if you do weekly, monthly emails or meetings and how the flow of communication is going. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So as part of building out the DAISY model for that team, one of those decisions is like, there are different words for this. You can call it DRI. Amazon has talked about this concept of the single threaded leader, but really what you're trying to say is like, okay, we have a cross-functional team of peers. When there's a call that needs to be made, who ultimately in that group of peers gets to make the call, and that person's generally in charge of communicating to the rest of the company. You should be able to go to anyone in that cross-functional team and get to the same answer, but it's this person's job to really drive that communication, outward. So what we're trying to do is for every like strategic functional team, and here's, whatever you want to call it, the DRI, the single threaded leader, at Pinterest, we called it owners versus leaders. Like all of the cross-functional team is the owner, but this person's the leader. So whatever kind of, framework you want to use that makes sense for you, having it clear of like, it's this person's job in the cross-functional team to do that and to break ties is really helpful. I was talking about this with Whatnot yesterday, which is a company I advise, collectibles marketplace. And we were talking about what are escalations for? Escalations are not for the cross-functional team disagrees. If the cross-functional team disagrees, there should be a DRI that's like, I'm going to make the call on this particular area. And that DRI can be at the project level. It's not like, okay, the product manager makes all the calls related to discovery. It could be the engineering manager is the DRI for this part of discovery. The product manager is the DRI for this part of discovery, because there are multiple things that are going on at the same time on a team. But just be clear about who it is. We use the team charter concept to write those things down. So we make sure everyone aligned. Escalations are for when one team's mission collides with another team's mission, and you need an executive to break the tie on which one's more important to the business right now. So you want to prevent escalations that are the team just doesn't agree. That means someone isn't empowered to make the call at the team level. You want to save escalations for, hey, I have this OKR, but if I want to actually drive toward that, it will sacrifice this other OKR, and I need someone further up at the company who can balance those two against each other. So that's how we think about that. In terms of the too many people in the meeting part of the question, just take the revenue working group. It's like that DRI who's going to show up to the meeting, but if they can't make it, someone else on the team is going to sub in for them. And the same is generally true for the monthly operating review. So there's going to be a representative from that team. It's usually going to be the same person, but if that person's out or can't make it, they've subbed in someone else who should have basically the exact same context.
That makes a ton of sense to me, Casey. When you think about kind of agreement between people on a team, oftentimes, even within a cross-functional working group, you have kind of OKRs in conflict, because each of those cross-functional people has some functional work and some like non-functional work. Do you feel like the team should be able to resolve those things themselves, or not?
Generally, yes. Like if it's functional work, that's like a competing OKR, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then that individual is going to need some direction of like, hey, Matt, do I prioritize this over this? Both of them are in my OKRs, and I can't necessarily do them both at the same time. So that's something where they probably need more manager feedback. But in thinking about cross-functional teams, if the teams agreed all the time, we wouldn't need all those people. We gain from having the different points of view. And a core cultural value of Pinterest when I was there is this concept of knit, which is people from different backgrounds working together create solutions that are greater than the sum of their parts. So there's creativity that comes out of that conflict.
Mm-hmm.
If the team is dragging on that conflict and can't get to a superior resolution, then either there's something broken in the trust with the team, and that needs to be, ideally they can work that out themselves, but a lot of times you're going to need leadership help to work through that. Or they really haven't been clear on what their priorities are. So there's competition in engineering priorities versus product priorities or design priorities, et cetera. Which means they probably didn't write their OKRs very well for the previous quarter. That conflict should be resolved in the planning process, right? So conflict is great. Like there should be disagreement and debate within the team. You don't want them agreeing all the time, because if so, they're probably not getting the best ideas out there for discussion. But they need a process to align. And even if, let's say you and I are on a team together, we disagree on the best course of action. Oh, we've said Matt's the DRI. He's made the call. I'm disagreeing and committing. You will never hear me talk, negatively about the decision we made because I'm in, right? And that's a concept that I think Amazon invented that I've used at pretty much every company I've been at. And I think it's really important. And people being unwilling to disagree and commit actually becomes a performance problem, right? Because that's such a key to building a great team. Because I'm not going to agree with all the decisions we make, as a company, but I need to get behind all of them once that decision's been made by the person responsible for making the decision.
Yeah, I think I wholeheartedly agree with that, with one difference. I'm curious as how you feel about this. I think there's a window in which you disagree and commit for, and then there's a moment where the team has to be able to be retrospective and open that discussion up again. So it's like, hey, we're going to commit to this decision for 6 months, see what happens, get some learnings, and then we'll review whether it was a good decision or not. And at that point, there's going to be open discussion about continuing it forward versus changing it again.
I think that's a really important point, because there's a time frame which, once we've made a decision, that we want to evaluate it for results and learning, right? What you don't want is, when the thing's not going well early on, for one of us to be saying, I told you so, we should switch. You got to ride that out for the time period that we determined. After that time period that we've determined, saying like, okay, what did we learn? What did we want to do? And not even saying, I told you so in that meeting, saying like, okay, we made a bet, didn't work out, we should go this different direction. I think that's all really healthy. The way we structure that at the team level at Eventbrite, and we did something similar at Pinterest, is when you launch something, after it goes through product review, we basically schedule a time, generally like 6 weeks out in the future, but it's custom based on the length of the project, which we call results review. And in that, you have to say, hey, you launched this in some capacity. It could have been an A/B test. You could have rolled it out. You could have just shipped it to everyone. What happened? What did we learn? Did we hit our goals? What do we want to do next based on the information we learned? What tech debt or design debt did we accumulate if we ran a little lean on building that project that we don't want to keep out there long term? And that's really about building that learning culture element, so that we're making the right decisions and that we're talking about the right things. And yeah, so I think that's really important. Retros at the team level for even like sprints is a good way to do that, right? Depending on your process, you can customize how often you do them. But yeah, very important point.
Yeah, I love that. And it takes us full circle back to our original discussion. Is like, hey, lots of information is changing right now, and it's important to be retrospective. Also, it's important for teams to be aligned. One of the people I work with regularly says alignment eats strategy for breakfast. And it's like, when everyone's marching to the same tune, you actually get shit done. It doesn't matter how awesome your strategy is if you're not shipping. So in this time, I hope everybody is shipping some awesome stuff and having a big impact. Casey, I appreciate you joining us despite the fire alarm in your building. And I love the very green background we got in the end. We'll send some follow-up from the event today, which will give us an opportunity to share out the Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture. And maybe we'll be able to snag some of the notes from that cultural values worksheet that Casey had to share with everybody. Our next event here at Reforge is November 16th. Casey, where can our guests find you on social if they're looking?
There's my blog, caseyaccidental.com, and then I'm at OneCaseman on Twitter. So you can always reach out to me there.
Awesome. Well, Casey, I'll be reaching out to you so we can hang out soon. And Brittany, thanks for putting this together. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming today. Have an awesome day. And hopefully nobody else has a fire alarm they have to deal with.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.